So the topic at hand is police brutality. Many of you are already familiar with it, have heard the term, been watching the news, been on Twitter lately and seen what's been happening in Baltimore with the death of Freddie Gray, the reasons behind it, but that is just one footnote in a history of incredibly unjust law enforcement behavior to its extreme. And this is just covering in the U.S., whereas police brutality in general ranges all over the world, has been happening for hundreds of years, and this is just the effect that it has in the U.S. and the people living in it.
Police brutality is the use of excessive force, usually physical, but also common in forms of verbal attacks and psychological intimidation. Police brutality exists in many countries, even those that prosecute it. It's one of the several forms of police misuse of power, which includes false arrest, intimidation, racial profiling, political repression, surveillance abuse, sexual abuse, and police corruption. However, it may involve physical force, but almost never reaching death under police custody. Even though murder is illegal, it can still be done under the color of the law.
So police brutality has been around for quite some time and dates back hundreds of years again. So in the U.S. specifically, it's tended to have grown. In the 1960s, the civil rights movement, the anti-war demonstrations, even the protests against Wall Street. I mean, there's an array of reasons where police brutality has been seen. And it was only in 2014 that the UN Committee Against Torture actually condemned police brutality and its excessive use of violence, specifically in the U.S. and specifically with its unjust shootings and recurrent fatalities of unarmed black citizens in the U.S.
The Civil Rights Era. The police during the Civil Rights Movement were a major part of why violence was very prominent. When it came to activists fighting for equal rights and holding marches, the police were the ones who responded to protest. Many of the police officers responded violently and used excessive force. Although some policemen would actually arrest activists in order to avoid any foreseen violence, many chose to not choose the latter to decrease violence.
So some of you might already be familiar with Selma because of the recent movie that was released and nominated for an Oscar. But on a more real note, in March 7th, 1965, 525 to around 600 people marched from Selma to Montgomery, and the police brutality that was inflicted upon these peaceful protesters was completely uncalled for. It was deemed Bloody Sunday. 17 protesters were sent to the hospital. About 50 in total were hurt. They knocked them to the ground. They beat them, tear gas. They were throwing bricks. They were charging them, marching against them on horseback. It was kind of insane. But the only good thing that came out of it were that they prompted the bill that was approved by President Johnson, and it led to the Voting Rights Act.
On November 9, 2011, students and professors at UC Berkeley participated in a series of teach-outs around campus. Protesters linked arms to form a human chain in front of the tents to prevent officers from taking down what they had set up. Police used 36-inch riot batons to jab and push back protesters to break the human chain. Robert Haas, a UC Berkeley professor of poetry, New York Times opinion piece entitled "Poet Bashing Police," said, "The deputies in the cordon surged forward and, using their clubs as battering rams, began to hammer at the bodies of the line of students. It was stunning to see. They swung hard into their chests and bellies. Particularly shocking to me, it must be a generational reaction, was that they assaulted both young men and young women with the same indiscriminate force. If the students turned away, they pounded their ribs. If they turned further away to escape, they hit them on their spines."
Some of the most recent unarmed black deaths were with Eric Garner and Mike Brown. Mike Brown was an 18-year-old unarmed black male shot down by Darren Wilson, a white cop in Ferguson, Missouri. This has sparked highly controversial outrage. Everyone was protesting. They militarized Ferguson. There was a curfew. There was tear gas, bricks being thrown. And it was one of the most recent cases that went viral and kind of sparked conversation and debate. Eric Garner is another recent case where law enforcement, and specifically the NYPD, was completely unjust and chokeholded him during an arrest. He died, and this was all caught on tape. This was shown on the news. You essentially saw a man die on camera. This sparked huge protests, a lot of debate and conversation, specifically also because chokeholds are not permitted by the NYPD. And no one was prosecuted or charged with homicide in this case either.
Kelly Thomas was a homeless man diagnosed with schizophrenia who lived on the streets of Fullerton, California. He was beaten and killed by 3 cops, members of the Fullerton Police Department, on July 5, 2011. Thomas was taken to St. Jude's Medical Center before being transferred to UC Irvine Medical Center, where he was in a comatose state upon arrival and not expected to recover. He never regained consciousness and died July 10, 2011. 2 former Fullerton police officers were found not guilty of the beating.
The NYPD is one of the most aggressive law enforcement agencies in the U.S. There are countless reports daily coming in of NYPD aggression, from health to human services, sanitation, transportation. It's kind of all over the place. There's, allegations of extreme violence and abuse from people, just playing their guitar in the subway, to homeless people, especially with the stop and search law, where many cops are racially profiling youth and, adults, thinking they look suspicious coming up to them and having the right to pat them up and down. And this is these are pretty extreme cases, and the allowance of it in New York is completely uncalled for.
Police brutality is colorblind. From other cases throughout the years, it's been clear the problem doesn't stem from racism. It stems from the lack of awareness of how to treat people like a decent human being. Danny Rodriguez was 28. He was a Latino, and he died in 2011. Johnny Gamage was 31. He was black, and he died in 1995. Otto Zem was 36, white, and he died in 2006. Joe Campos Torres is 23, Latino, and he died in 1977. James Philip Chase Jr. was 40. He was white, and he died in 2006. Timothy Stansberry was 19, black, and he died in 2004.
Not only are cops sometimes unable to handle humans and show aggression and violence towards them, they also do the same with animals, specifically dogs. They've been assaulting not only people, but killing animals on site as well. San Diego police shot a man's service dog after responding to a domestic violence call, and they were at the wrong house to begin with. Hawthorne police also shot a Rottweiler down. The entire confrontation is on YouTube. It was while they were arresting a man, a person of color, and they shot his Rottweiler down when it kind of became, weird to control. It kind of raises the question if they're even equipped and know how to deal with these situations in the first place.
The reactions from the communities have been mixed. Some go for the silent protest route, while others turn violent against other cops, or some loot and destroy property. Yet even if the protests are silent and not violent, sometimes police officers can grow impatient and begin to brutalize the protesters.
We covered a few issues when it comes to police brutality and the reasons behind it, but race is really one of the major issues where police brutality is stemming from. It was discovered that in Florida, there was a police department that was using mugshots of black men for target practice. Racial profiling is the #1 cause for unwarranted deaths and arrests at the hands of police officers. The incarcerations of black men completely outweigh any other group of people. And people of color feel targeted. They feel unsafe. They feel untrusting of cops. And from Mike Brown to Eric Garner to Freddie Gray, race has played a huge role in unjust police brutality.
Officers tend to use the phrases like self-defense and imminent danger and so on and so forth to justify the brutality placed upon civilians. But in reality, the only time they should use any excessive force is in their life is in immediate danger. Yet they use it for any reason.
So one of the many questions people are having with these debates is, how do I avoid it? Is it avoidable? Sometimes it's not. That's the truth of it. Sometimes, a cop can pull you over. Sometimes a cop can stop you and pat you down. The most important thing you can do is know your rights. Know how to handle the situation. Speak clearly. Speak calmly. Have your hands raised. And tell them if you feel unsafe. Tell them you're not comfortable with something if that's how you feel. Um, a violation of privacy is really important, and you don't want to, result in any unfortunate events. So it's very important to communicate clearly and concisely with cops. And the hands up, don't shoot has been a very powerful motif throughout all this.
If there were things done to better our society, some of the possible outcomes would be decrease in deaths in the community, faith restored in police officers. People would be more receptive to law officials and possibly more forthcoming with information. Or a more harmonious community of police officers become more sympathetic to people in their...
So the question you should be asking yourself is, how do we make it safer? How do we move on from unwarranted deaths? How do we move on from uncalled excessive use of violence? Many people have been suggesting that cops wear cameras on the uniforms available for review during any situation or complaint, having law enforcement take classes on, maybe more deeper classes on how to deal with situations where they just, instead of just resulting in killing, having officers pass psyche tests to prove that they are in fact sane and they aren't a danger to the public. Knowing your rights and always having the cops' name and information down is a pivotal step towards making it safer for yourself when the cop knows that you know what's going on and you are aware, and he can't just get away with doing what he wants.
People would feel more comfortable coming to officers instead of fearing them. A more cooperative audience, and police officers wouldn't have to fear being classified as officers that have done wrong and wrongfully prosecuted by other society members. Officers would be able to help and not hurt the communities they protect.
One of the most recent examples of police brutality was with another person of color. It was with Freddie Gray in Baltimore. He was arrested for looking suspicious in an area that was high on drug traffic. On the way to the police station, they made 3 unauthorized stops. He was injured in the neck when they picked him up. By the time they got to the police station, he couldn't speak, he couldn't breathe, he could barely move. He ended up in a coma and died a week later. That is unfortunate, but the only good thing that came from it was the cop was charged with homicide. He was prosecuted, and this does have cops realize that, they can't necessarily get away with neglecting life of an arrested person. They will be responsible for their actions, and they will have to answer for someone's injury.
And in conclusion, there will always be an issue with police officers having a power trip complex. And granted, there will never be a completely violent-free community, but if we can teach them they're no better than anyone else, maybe, just maybe, we could better our society. And that at least is a small step towards a better society.